Some people think humiliation is power, until the wrong person stays calm. The rain had followed Vanessa Brooks all the way from the south side of Chicago, dripping softly from the hem of her dark gray coat as she stepped into the polished luxury department store with her 10-year-old daughter beside her. Warm air wrapped around them the second the glass doors closed behind them, carrying the scent of perfume, leather handbags, and fresh coffee from the cafe upstairs. Her daughter, Ava, squeezed her hand tighter while staring at the giant Christmas display glowing under white marble lights nearly 20 feet overhead. Vanessa smiled faintly. She had worked a 12-hour overnight shift at a hospice care center less than 2 hours earlier, and exhaustion sat quietly beneath her eyes, but tonight mattered. Ava had earned a spot in the state middle school debate finals, and Vanessa had promised her one new pair of shoes for the competition. Just one. Nothing extravagant. Something clean and professional that would make her daughter feel confident standing behind a microphone in front of hundreds of people. Vanessa checked the folded bills inside her wallet again before walking toward the women's section. Every movement she made was careful, measured, respectful. But from the second they entered the store, Richard Coleman was already watching them. The store manager stood near the fragrance counter with his arms crossed tightly against his expensive navy suit. His expression sharpening the moment he noticed Vanessa's worn sneakers and the rainwater darkening her sleeves. He leaned toward the younger assistant manager beside him and muttered something that made the man smirk under his breath. Vanessa pretended not to notice. She was used to that look. The look that scanned her clothes before her face. The look that quietly decided who belonged and who didn't. Ava pointed excitedly toward a pair of black dress shoes displayed beneath a soft golden spotlight. "Mom, those are perfect." Vanessa crouched beside her daughter, brushing damp curls away from the little girl's forehead. "Then let's try them on." Her voice stayed gentle, calm, warm enough to soften the cold. Rain still clinging to their jackets. A young sales associate approached nervously with a shoebox while Richard continued staring from across the floor. Around them, holiday music drifted softly through hidden speakers while wealthy shoppers carried glossy bags between marble columns and mirrored walls. For a moment, Vanessa allowed herself to breathe. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Then the security alarm suddenly exploded through the store. Loud, sharp, violent enough to freeze every conversation instantly. Heads turned. Ava jumped. Vanessa stopped moving. Richard was already marching toward them before the echo faded. "I knew it," he said loudly, his polished shoes striking hard against the marble floor. The entire store seemed to lean toward the scene unfolding beside the shoe display. Vanessa blinked once, confused but composed. There must be some mistake. Richard stepped closer. Too close. "Open your bag." Ava looked up at her mother with frightened eyes while nearby customers slowly lifted their phones. Vanessa tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, but kept her voice steady. "Sir, I paid for everything I brought in." Richard's jaw flexed. "People like you always say that." The words landed heavier than the alarm itself. The air inside the luxury store suddenly felt colder than the storm outside. Vanessa said nothing. She simply looked at him quietly while rainwater slid down the giant glass windows behind them like tears no one wanted to acknowledge. Vanessa could feel every pair of eyes inside the store pressing against her skin, but she refused to let her hands shake. Ava stood beside her clutching the edge of her mother's coat, while the alarm continued blinking red above the entrance like the building itself had already decided they were guilty. Richard Coleman folded his arms and stared at Vanessa with the confidence of a man who had never once been questioned in his own kingdom. "Set the bag down slowly," he said. His voice echoed across the polished marble floor, drawing even more attention from shoppers drifting closer behind perfume displays and jewelry counters. Vanessa exhaled quietly before placing her faded brown handbag onto the glass counter beside the register. "I did not take anything," she said carefully. "Then you have nothing to worry about." Richard gave a cold smile that never reached his eyes. The young sales associate standing nearby looked uncomfortable now. She could not have been older than 23. Her name tag read Emily. Vanessa noticed the girl glance nervously between the manager and Ava, whose small fingers still trembled around her mother's sleeve. Outside, rainwater streamed down the giant front windows in silver lines while headlights smeared across the wet Chicago streets beyond the glass. Inside, The warmth of the luxury store suddenly felt suffocating. Richard unzipped the handbag himself without asking permission. He pulled out a paperback book with bent corners, a half-empty bottle of water, a phone charger wrapped neatly with a rubber band, and a folded set of navy blue scrubs from the hospice center where Vanessa worked overnight shifts caring for dying patients. The sight of the scrubs made Emily's expression soften immediately. Richard barely reacted. He continued searching through the bag while customers whispered nearby. "Mom," Ava whispered carefully, "we should just go." Vanessa looked down at her daughter and gently brushed a hand against her shoulder. "No, baby. We did nothing wrong." Her voice remained calm enough to surprise even herself. Years earlier, she might have raised her voice. Years earlier, humiliation might have pulled anger out of her chest like fire. But life had taught her that dignity often frightened cruel people more than shouting ever could. Richard suddenly held up a small velvet jewelry box. Several customers gasped softly. Ava's eyes widened in confusion. "What is that?" she asked. Richard looked almost satisfied now. "Interesting," he said loudly enough for the growing crowd to hear. "Very interesting." Vanessa frowned for the first time. "That is not mine." Richard gave a short laugh under his breath. "Of course it is not." Emily stepped forward carefully. "Sir, I do not think that came from her bag." Richard shot her a sharp look that immediately silenced her. Vanessa watched the exchange closely. She recognized fear when she saw it. The kind that lived inside employees who depended on every paycheck. The kind that kept good people quiet. Richard opened the jewelry box dramatically, revealing a diamond bracelet glittering beneath the bright department lights. A middle-aged customer near the cosmetics section shook her head slowly while lifting her phone higher to record. Vanessa felt Ava press closer against her side. "Mom, I am scared." Those 4 words cut deeper than the humiliation itself. Vanessa lowered herself slightly to meet her daughter's eyes. "Listen to me," she whispered softly. "You do not let people decide your value because they are louder than you." Ava nodded weakly, trying not to cry. Richard straightened his expensive tie before speaking again. "Security is already on the way." The rain outside grew heavier now, pounding softly against the windows while thunder rolled somewhere beyond downtown Chicago. Vanessa slowly stood back up, her face unreadable beneath the white store lights. She looked directly at Richard for several long seconds. Not angry, not afraid, just watching him carefully, almost like she already knew something he did not. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Richard's smile faded just a little. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the back hallway as 2 security guards appeared beside the fragrance counter, their black uniforms sharp against the white marble floors. One of them was tall and broad-shouldered with tired eyes and a silver name tag that read Marcus Hill. The moment he saw Ava holding onto her mother with tears gathering in her eyes, something in his expression shifted. He slowed slightly while Richard Coleman pointed aggressively toward Vanessa and the open handbag on the counter. "That is her," Richard announced loudly, making sure every nearby customer could hear him. "We caught her with stolen merchandise." Marcus looked at the diamond bracelet still sitting inside the velvet box. Then he looked at Vanessa. Calm, dry-eyed, exhausted from work, not panic. He had spent nearly 15 years doing security jobs across Chicago malls and retail stores, and experience had taught him that guilty people usually talk too much. Vanessa Brooks barely spoke at all. "Ma'am," Marcus said respectfully, "do you mind telling me what happened?" Before Vanessa could answer, Richard interrupted immediately. "What happened is obvious." He straightened his jacket proudly while several customers continued recording with their phones. The alarm went off the second she walked past the sensors. Vanessa met Marcus's eyes. "I came here to buy shoes for my daughter. That bracelet is not mine." Marcus nodded slowly, listening carefully. Richard scoffed under his breath. "Of course she says that." Emily stood frozen beside the register, nervously rubbing her hands together. The young sales associate looked like she wanted to say something, but could not force the words out. Marcus noticed that too. "Did anyone actually see her take anything?" he asked calmly. Richard's jaw tightened. "The evidence is sitting right there." Thunder rolled softly outside the giant windows while rain hammered against the Chicago streets harder now, blurring the city lights into streaks of gold and white. The entire luxury store seemed trapped inside a strange silence where nobody wanted to interfere, but nobody wanted to leave either. Ava suddenly looked up at Marcus with trembling eyes. My mom did not steal anything. Her voice was small, fragile, but honest enough to cut through the tension for a brief second. Marcus crouched slightly to her level. I hear you. Richard exhaled sharply, irritated by the slowing momentum. He had expected quick obedience, not questions. Marcus, we do not need a courtroom debate, he snapped. Handle it. Marcus stood back upright, but did not move toward Vanessa. Instead, he glanced toward the ceiling cameras positioned above the handbag display. We can review security footage first. Richard's face changed instantly. Only slightly, but enough for Vanessa to notice. The cameras near this section were glitching earlier, Richard answered quickly. Convenient timing, Marcus said quietly. Richard ignored him. Look, I know how these situations work. People walk into high-end stores pretending to shop while planning something else. Vanessa remained perfectly still as those words settled into the air around her. Nearby, an older black couple standing near the escalator exchanged a painful glance without saying a word. They understood exactly what Richard meant. Marcus understood too. Emily swallowed hard before finally speaking in a shaky voice. Sir, I do not think Ms. Brooks put that bracelet in her bag. The moment the words left her mouth, Richard turned toward her slowly. The pressure in his stare alone made her pale. Excuse me. Emily lowered her eyes immediately. I just mean, I did not actually see her take anything. Richard stepped closer to the counter, lowering his voice enough to sound colder than loud anger ever could. You are new here, Emily, so let me explain something. This store survives because we protect our image. If security alarms go off, we act. Vanessa watched the fear return to the young woman's face. The same fear she had seen in hospitals, offices, classrooms, and waiting rooms her entire life. Fear of losing rent money. Fear of losing health insurance. Fear of powerful people deciding your future in one sentence. Marcus folded his arms slowly. And what if your image is wrong? Richard laughed once, sharp and humorless. It is not wrong tonight. But even as he said it, Vanessa noticed something else beneath his confidence now. Not certainty. Not authority. Worry. Richard Coleman had built his entire career on one belief. Confidence mattered more than truth. As long as he sounded certain, wore the right suit, and spoke with enough authority, people usually obeyed without asking questions. That belief had carried him from assistant manager to regional leadership candidate in less than 6 years. Inside this store, surrounded by polished marble floors, 12-foot glass displays, and customers carrying $400 handbags, Richard saw himself as the gatekeeper of status. He decided who looked valuable and who looked suspicious long before security cameras ever did. Vanessa Brooks represented everything he assumed did not belong in his world. The wet coat, the tired eyes, the carefully folded cash in her wallet, the little girl staring too long at expensive shoes. In Richard's mind, the conclusion had already been written before the alarm even sounded. Marcus could sense that arrogance filling the air now like smoke. The security guard remained beside Vanessa while more customers gathered near the center of the store, pretending to browse while quietly listening to every word. Some faces carried curiosity. Others carried discomfort. But nobody stepped forward. Nobody challenged Richard directly. Wealthy spaces had their own kind of silence. Emily stood near the register with her hands trembling slightly against the counter. She kept replaying the last few minutes in her head. The velvet jewelry box had not come from Vanessa's bag. She knew that. She had seen Richard reach behind the display counter seconds before security approached. But knowing something and saying it out loud inside a workplace were two completely different things. Rent in Chicago was expensive. Student loans did not pause for morality. Richard suddenly turned toward Vanessa again. I am giving you one last chance to cooperate before police get involved. His voice was smoother now, almost rehearsed. Vanessa looked directly at him without blinking. I have cooperated this entire time. Then explain the bracelet. I cannot explain something I did not take. Richard laughed quietly, shaking his head like a disappointed teacher dealing with a difficult student. You know what amazes me? People always think staying calm makes them believable. Vanessa heard Ava breathing harder beside her. The little girl had stopped crying now, but fear still lived inside her eyes. Vanessa gently rubbed circles against her daughter's back without looking away from Richard. No, she answered softly. Staying calm reminds people who they are. For a brief second, Richard looked confused by the response. Then irritation returned immediately. Marcus, he snapped, remove them from the sales floor. But Marcus did not move. Sir, with respect, I still think we should review the footage first. Richard's face darkened. I am the manager here, and I am responsible for security procedure. The tension between the two men sharpened instantly beneath the bright white lighting overhead. Rain crashed harder against the massive windows while distant thunder rolled across downtown Chicago. Somewhere behind the crowd, a customer quietly whispered, "This is being live-streamed." Richard heard that. Vanessa noticed the flicker of panic hidden behind his eyes again. His attention darted briefly toward the phones pointed in his direction before he quickly regained composure. Wonderful, he muttered sarcastically. Then everyone can watch accountability in action. Vanessa lowered her eyes for the first time, not in shame, but toward the polished marble floor reflecting the store lights beneath her feet. The reflection blurred slightly in the rain-colored glow coming through the windows. She remembered standing in another building years ago, another room filled with executives who underestimated quiet people. Back then, she had learned something important. Arrogant men usually exposed themselves eventually if nobody interrupted them. So she remained silent. Richard mistook that silence for weakness again. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. You should have walked away when you had the chance. Vanessa slowly lifted her eyes back to his face. Calm, controlled, almost strangely patient now. No, she said quietly. I think you are the one who should have done that. Something about the way she said it made Marcus glance toward her more carefully. Not fearful, not defensive, certain, as if this moment was moving exactly where she expected it to go. And somewhere deep beneath Richard Coleman's confidence, the first real crack finally began to form. The atmosphere inside the store had changed completely now. What began as suspicion had turned into spectacle. More customers drifted toward the center of the sales floor, pretending to browse winter coats and designer handbags while secretly watching the confrontation unfold beneath the bright white ceiling lights. Several phones remained raised, recording every second. The soft holiday music playing through the speakers now felt almost surreal against the tension tightening the air. Richard Coleman hated losing control in public. Vanessa could see it in the stiffness of his jaw and the way he kept adjusting the cuffs of his expensive suit jacket. He wanted quick obedience. He wanted fear. Instead, the woman standing in front of him remained composed in a way he could not understand. That calmness unsettled him more than anger ever would have. This conversation is over, Richard announced sharply. Marcus, escort them out immediately. Ava flinched at the word escort, gripping her mother tighter. Vanessa slowly placed one hand over her daughter's small fingers. We are not leaving until this is cleared up. Richard laughed bitterly. You are in no position to make demands. Marcus remained still beside them. Sir, if the footage exists, we should review it before forcing anyone out. I already told you the cameras were malfunctioning. Then we should verify that too. Richard turned toward Marcus with visible irritation now. Whose side are you on? Marcus answered calmly. The truth does not have sides. The words landed heavily in the growing silence. Vanessa noticed several employees exchanging nervous glances behind nearby displays. They were listening carefully now, watching Richard carefully. Emily stood frozen behind the register, her face pale beneath the store lighting. She knew exactly what had happened. She knew Richard had slipped the bracelet into the handbag while pretending to search it. But every time she tried to speak, fear closed around her throat again. Richard suddenly pointed toward Vanessa's daughter. You are upsetting the child by dragging this out. Vanessa's expression changed for the first time. Only slightly, but enough for Marcus to notice. No, she said quietly. What is upsetting her is watching adults abuse power. Richard's face hardened instantly. That is enough. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only nearby people could hear. You should be grateful we are handling this privately. Vanessa almost smiled at that. Privately, in front of dozens of customers and livestream cameras. The irony hung heavily in the air between them. Outside the store, flashing headlights reflected across rain-soaked streets while thunder rolled deeper through the city. The storm seemed to press against the giant windows surrounding the luxury building. Like the night itself was listening. Ava suddenly looked up at her mother again. Mom, can we just go home? Vanessa looked down at her daughter gently. She could see exhaustion spreading across the little girl's face now. It had been a long day already before any of this happened. A school debate practice. Hours waiting while Vanessa slept after her overnight hospice shift. Then the train ride downtown through freezing rain because parking near the shopping district cost too much. Vanessa brushed a thumb softly against Ava's cheek. Sometimes walking away teaches people they can do this to someone else tomorrow. Ava tried to understand those words, even through fear. Richard rolled his eyes impatiently. This is unbelievable. Then one of the customers near the escalator suddenly spoke up. A middle-aged white woman wearing a long cream-colored coat lowered her phone slowly. Actually, she said carefully, I saw your employee bring that jewelry box over before security arrived. The entire store froze. Richard turned toward her immediately. Excuse me. The woman hesitated under the pressure of his stare, but continued anyway. I am just saying. I do not think it came from her bag originally. Another customer nodded slowly nearby. I saw that too. The silence that followed felt enormous. Richard's confidence flickered again, weaker this time. Emily finally inhaled sharply and stepped forward from behind the register. Her voice trembled badly. She is telling the truth. Richard stared at her in disbelief. Emily, I saw it, she whispered. You placed the bracelet there. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. Rain hammered against the glass walls while the store lights reflected sharply across Richard Coleman's face for several long seconds. And for the first time all night, the powerful manager standing at the center of the luxury store looked completely alone. No one inside the store spoke after Emily's confession. The silence arrived so suddenly, it almost sounded physical, like the entire building had inhaled at once and forgotten how to breathe again. Rain continued sliding down the giant glass windows in slow silver streams while the glow of Chicago traffic shimmered across the marble floor beneath everyone's feet. Richard Coleman stared at Emily as if betrayal itself had just stepped out from behind the register. You need to think very carefully about what you are saying, he said quietly. But the sharp confidence that once filled his voice had weakened now. Emily swallowed hard. Her hands shook visibly against the edge of the counter, but something inside her had already crossed the point of fear. I saw you place it there, she repeated softly. You thought nobody noticed. Marcus looked toward Richard without speaking. Around them, several customers slowly lowered their phones, no longer recording out of curiosity, but out of disbelief. Vanessa remained completely still through all of it. Her calmness no longer looked defensive. It looked deliberate. Ava leaned quietly against her mother's side, exhausted from crying, her small eyes drifting between the adults around her like she was trying to understand how people could become so cruel so quickly. Richard laughed suddenly, but the sound felt thin and unnatural. This is ridiculous, he snapped. One nervous employee says something emotional, and suddenly everyone forgets the alarm. He pointed toward the entrance sensors as though technology itself could rescue him. The system went off for a reason. Marcus finally stepped closer to the counter and picked up the velvet bracelet box carefully. Then we can verify inventory records and camera timestamps. Richard's jaw tightened again. I already told you the cameras were down. That is strange, Marcus answered calmly. Because the security monitor in the hallway looked active 5 minutes ago. Richard did not answer immediately. Outside, thunder rolled deeper through the storm, while flashing headlights painted moving reflections across the wet glass walls. The luxury store no longer felt elegant. It felt exposed. Like every polished surface inside the building was reflecting something ugly back at itself. Vanessa slowly turned her attention toward Emily. The young employee looked terrified now, standing alone beneath the bright white lights after speaking against her manager publicly. Vanessa understood that kind of fear deeply. It was the fear of knowing truth could cost you your livelihood. Thank you, Vanessa said softly. Emily blinked in surprise. No anger, no bitterness, just gratitude. The simple kindness nearly made the young woman cry harder than the confrontation itself. Richard noticed the emotional shift happening around him and became desperate to regain control. Enough, he barked suddenly. Everybody needs to calm down. But nobody listened this time. The illusion surrounding him had started collapsing too visibly now. Customers whispered openly. Employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. Even the soft holiday music drifting through the ceiling speakers sounded distant and hollow beneath the tension spreading across the sales floor. Marcus turned toward Vanessa carefully. Ma'am, I believe you deserve an apology. Richard immediately interrupted. We are not apologizing for following store policy. Vanessa finally looked directly at him again. "No," she said quietly. "You were not following policy." The words landed with terrifying calmness. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Something about Vanessa's expression unsettled him now more than ever before. She did not look relieved. She did not look victorious. If anything, she looked disappointed. Like someone watching another human being fail a test they never realized they were taking. Ava tugged gently on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, can we leave now?" Vanessa looked down at her daughter, then toward the massive windows where rain continued washing across the city outside. For several long seconds, she said nothing at all. The entire store seemed to wait with her. Then, somewhere near the front entrance, the sound of car doors slamming shut echoed faintly through the storm outside. Marcus glanced toward the windows first. Bright headlights cut across the rain. A line of black vehicles had just pulled up directly in front of the store. Richard frowned immediately. "What now?" he muttered under his breath. Employees near the entrance turned nervously as several people in dark coats stepped out into the rain and began walking quickly toward the building. Vanessa saw them. Before anyone else fully understood what was happening, her expression never changed. But for the first time all night, she slowly reached into her coat pocket and removed a small silver access card attached to a black leather holder. Marcus noticed the company logo embossed on the front instantly. And the moment he did, the entire night suddenly stopped making sense in a completely different way. The front doors opened against the storm with a rush of cold Chicago air that swept across the sales floor and carried rainwater onto the polished marble entrance. Every head inside the store turned at once. For people in dark tailored coats stepped through the doorway, followed by two corporate security officers carrying leather portfolios beneath their arms. They were not rushing chaotically. They moved with the sharp precision of people accustomed to boardrooms, private elevators, and billion-dollar decisions. Richard Coleman stared at them in confusion at first, still trying to hold onto the collapsing remains of his authority. Then he recognized the woman leading the group. Elaine Whitmore, Chief Executive Officer of Whitmore Retail Group. The color drained from his face instantly. Elaine rarely visited stores personally. Most regional managers never even met her in person. Yet here she was, standing inside his location on a stormy Thursday night with rain still glistening across her black wool coat. The entire store fell silent as Elaine's eyes scanned the scene in front of her. The crying child, the nervous employees, the open handbag, the velvet jewelry box still resting on the counter. Then her eyes landed on Vanessa Brooks. And everything about Elaine changed. Her posture softened immediately. Her expression tightened with something that looked almost like panic. "Vanessa," she said quietly. The room froze harder than before. Richard blinked in disbelief. Elaine Whitmore never used first names with employees. Not publicly. Not like that. Vanessa stood calmly beneath the bright lights, one hand resting gently on Ava's shoulder while rainwater still darkened the edges of her coat sleeves. "Good evening, Elaine," she answered softly. Richard looked between them, confusion twisting into fear so quickly it almost looked painful. "Wait, you know her." Elaine turned slowly toward him. For the first time all night, Richard Coleman truly understood what power looked like. It was not loud. It did not need to shout. It simply entered a room and changed the oxygen inside it. "Know her?" Elaine repeated carefully. "Richard, this is Vanessa Brooks." Richard swallowed hard. Nobody moved. Nobody even lowered their phones anymore. "She founded this company with my father 23 years ago." The words hit the store like thunder. Emily covered her mouth in shock. Marcus stared at Vanessa with widening eyes as pieces of the entire night suddenly rearranged themselves in his mind. The silver access card, the calmness, the certainty. Ava looked up at her mother quietly, already aware of the truth but too young to fully understand why adults suddenly looked terrified now. Richard gave a nervous laugh that sounded completely broken. "There has to be some misunderstanding." Elaine stepped closer toward him. "No," she said coldly. "The misunderstanding happened when you assumed a black woman with wet shoes could not possibly belong in your store." Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. His confidence had completely disappeared now, leaving only raw fear behind. Vanessa finally reached into her coat pocket again and handed the silver access card to Marcus. He looked down at it carefully. Executive board clearance. Founder status authorization. Unlimited corporate access. His hands tightened slightly around the card. "Oh my God," Emily whispered under her breath. Outside, rain continued crashing against the giant windows while lightning flashed across the dark Chicago skyline beyond the glass. Inside, nobody could look away from Richard Coleman. The man who spent the last hour humiliating a woman he thought was powerless now stood trembling beneath the same white lights he once controlled. Elaine looked toward the customers, still recording everything on their phones. "Corporate legal already saw the live stream," she said quietly. Richard's face lost the last bit of color remaining in it. Vanessa still had not raised her voice. Once, she had not threatened anyone, had not demanded respect, and somehow that made the moment even heavier. Ava tugged softly on her mother's sleeve. "Mom, can we go now?" Vanessa looked down at her daughter and gently brushed rain-damp curls away from her forehead. "Soon, baby." Then she slowly lifted her eyes back toward Richard Coleman. The entire store waited for anger, waited for humiliation, waited for revenge. But Vanessa Brooks only looked at him with the deep sadness of someone who had seen this kind of cruelty too many times before. And somehow, that expression hurt Richard far more than rage ever could. The storm outside showed no signs of slowing down. Rain pounded against the massive glass windows, while flashes of lightning briefly illuminated the Chicago skyline beyond the luxury store. Inside, however, the loudest thing in the room had become silence. Richard Coleman stood motionless near the counter, his expensive suit suddenly looking too small for him now, like authority itself had abandoned his body the moment the truth arrived. Nobody looked at him the same way anymore. Not the customers, not the employees, not even the young assistant manager who had spent months trying to imitate him. Elaine Whitmore stepped beside Vanessa carefully, lowering her voice. "I am deeply sorry this happened." Vanessa nodded once, but her expression remained distant. She was not interested in public sympathy, not after years of understanding how systems protected people like Richard until embarrassment forced accountability. Ava leaned sleepily against her mother now, emotionally drained from the entire night. Vanessa gently wrapped her coat around the little girl's shoulders, while Marcus quietly moved closer to shield them from the growing crowd gathering near the entrance. One of the corporate officers handed Elaine a tablet displaying the livestream clips already spreading online. The footage showed everything. The accusation, the humiliation, Emily speaking up, Richard's panic. Thousands of comments were already flooding social media feeds faster than the company could contain them. Elaine looked toward Richard slowly. "You falsified a theft accusation against a customer." Richard swallowed hard. "I was trying to protect the store." "No," Elaine answered coldly. "You were protecting your assumptions." Those words landed harder than shouting ever could. Richard looked toward Vanessa desperately now, almost searching for mercy before consequences fully arrived. "Ms. Brooks, I did not know who you were." Vanessa finally looked directly at him again. Her eyes held no triumph, only exhaustion. "That is the problem," she said quietly. "You should not need to know who someone is before treating them like a human being." The entire store fell silent again. Even the customers recording lowered their phones slightly after hearing that. Marcus looked away for a moment, jaw tightening subtly. Emily wiped tears from her face behind the register. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled through the city like the night itself was answering her words. Richard's shoulders sank lower. "I made a mistake." Vanessa studied him carefully for several long seconds. Then she glanced around the store, at the frightened employees, at the customers who watched without intervening, at the polished marble floors and glittering designer displays built to project perfection while human dignity collapsed beneath them so easily. "No," she said softly. "A mistake is spilling coffee on someone. This was a choice." Richard could not respond. Elaine handed the tablet back to the corporate officer and straightened her posture. "Effective immediately, Richard Coleman is terminated pending legal review." The words echoed sharply beneath the high white ceilings. Richard closed his eyes briefly like the sentence physically struck him. But Vanessa was still not finished. She looked toward Elaine calmly. "The problem does not end with him." Elaine listened carefully. "I want mandatory bias and ethics retraining across every store in this company," Vanessa continued quietly. "I want anonymous reporting protections for employees who speak up. And I want every executive in this region reviewed." Several corporate staff members exchanged nervous glances immediately. Vanessa noticed that too. "Because silence helped this happen tonight," she added. "Emily, lowered her eyes, ashamed, but Vanessa turned toward her gently. Speaking eventually still mattered. Emily looked stunned by the kindness in her voice after everything she had endured. Marcus handed Vanessa her handbag carefully, almost respectfully now. "For what it is worth," he said quietly, "you handled this with more grace than most people could." Vanessa gave him a faint, tired smile. "Grace is expensive," she answered softly. "People like me learn early how much it costs." Ava tugged lightly on her mother's sleeve again. "Mom, are we finally leaving?" This time Vanessa nodded. "Yes, baby." Elaine stepped aside immediately, opening a clear path toward the entrance. Customers moved silently out of the way as Vanessa and Ava began walking across the marble floor together. Nobody stopped them. Nobody questioned them. The same people who had stared suspiciously at Vanessa less than an hour earlier now watched her with something completely different in their eyes. Respect, shame, regret. And as Vanessa passed Richard Coleman for the final time, she never once looked back at the man who tried to humiliate her. Somehow, that hurt him more than anything else ever could. The rain outside had softened into a steady whisper by the time Vanessa Brooks and her daughter reached the front entrance of the store. The giant glass doors opened slowly as Marcus stepped forward to hold them, cold night air drifting inside across the polished marble floor behind them. For a moment, Vanessa paused beneath the soft glow of the entrance lights, her reflection faintly visible in the rain-streaked glass beside Ava's smaller silhouette. The city beyond them shimmered with wet pavement, blurred headlights, and distant train sounds echoing through downtown Chicago. Inside the store, nobody spoke. Employees stood frozen behind counters and displays, watching the woman they had judged, doubted, or failed to protect quietly walk away with more dignity than anyone else in the building possessed. Ava looked up at her mother as they stepped toward the sidewalk. "Mom," she asked softly, "why were they so mean to us?" Vanessa tightened her coat gently around her daughter's shoulders before answering. "Sometimes people see what they expect instead of what is real." Ava frowned slightly, trying to understand. "But you own the company." Vanessa glanced back once through the glass windows at the bright luxury store behind them. Richard Coleman still stood near the center of the sales floor, surrounded by silence, his head lowered now while corporate officers spoke quietly nearby. The same room that once made him feel powerful had become the place where he lost everything. "Baby," Vanessa said quietly, "they should have treated us with respect before they knew that." Ava nodded slowly. The little girl would remember tonight for the rest of her life. Not because of the humiliation, not because of the fear, but because she watched her mother remain kind in a moment where cruelty would have been easier. A black umbrella suddenly appeared over them. Elaine Whitmore had followed them outside into the rain despite the cold wind cutting through the street. "Vanessa," she called gently. Vanessa turned. Elaine looked different out here beneath the storm-dark sky, less like a chief executive officer, more like someone carrying genuine regret. "The board is already preparing emergency reforms," Elaine said quietly. "And Richard Coleman will never manage another store in this company again." Vanessa listened silently. Traffic lights reflected across puddles near the curb, while passing taxis sprayed water along the street. Somewhere above them, thunder rolled faintly beyond the skyline. Elaine hesitated before speaking again. "You built this company to give people dignity. I should have protected that better." Vanessa studied her old friend carefully. "Culture does not break in one night, Elaine," she answered softly. "It breaks slowly every time good people stay quiet." Elaine lowered her eyes briefly. She knew Vanessa was right. Behind the glass walls of the store, Emily stood near the entrance watching them through tears while Marcus quietly locked the doors early for the night. Neither employee would ever forget what happened there. Neither would the customers who live-streamed it across the country. By morning, millions of people would know Vanessa Brooks's name. But standing there beneath the cold Chicago rain, Vanessa seemed completely untouched by fame, revenge, or victory. She only looked tired. Ava suddenly tugged her mother's hand with a small smile. "Can we still get the shoes?" Vanessa looked down at her daughter and laughed softly for the first time all night. A real laugh, warm and gentle enough to cut through the cold air around them. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "We are definitely getting the shoes." Marcus stepped outside briefly carrying the shoebox Emily had set aside earlier. "She wanted your daughter to have these," he said quietly. Vanessa accepted the box carefully, surprised. Inside rested the black debate shoes Ava had pointed at hours ago beneath the golden display lights. Perfectly polished, perfectly sized. Ava's eyes widened instantly. "Mom." Vanessa looked back toward the store entrance where Emily stood watching nervously from inside. Vanessa placed one hand gently against the glass in silent gratitude. Emily smiled through tears and placed her own hand against the opposite side. No words passed between them. None were needed. Then Vanessa took Ava's hand again, and together they disappeared slowly into the rainy Chicago night beneath the glow of streetlights reflecting across wet pavement, while behind them the luxury store remained silent at last, as though the building itself had finally learned the difference between power and humanity.